Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Matthew Diller, and I have the honor of being the Dean of Fordham University School of Law, and I'm delighted to welcome you to both the law school and to Fordham University. And I bring the regards to all of you and to our governor from Father Joseph McShane, who is traveling and could not be with us here today, but welcomes you as well. At Fordham Law, in this service of others is more than our motto. We prepare Fordham Law students to confront the challenges of our times, to become leaders in the legal profession who will effect real change through principled ethical lawyering, through active citizenship, and through an unwavering dedication to justice. This is part of Fordham University's larger mission and its legacy of creating men and women for others. So we are extraordinarily pleased that Governor Andrew Cuomo, who completed his bachelor's degree at Fordham University in 1979, is upholding this tradition of public service. From his time as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under President Bill Clinton, through his work as New York State Attorney General, and through his commitment to the people of the state of New York as its 56th governor, Governor Cuomo continues to be a man for others. We are also pleased that the governor has chosen our law school as a fitting place to address the importance of ethics reform and the restoration of public trust in government. Now it is my honor to introduce to you Governor Andrew Cuomo.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you. It's my pleasure to be here today. Pleasure to be back at Fordham. As you heard from the dean, I went Fordham undergrad, but I went to the other campus. I was at Fordham in the Bronx. When I was at Fordham in the Bronx, we referred to that campus as the real Fordham campus, you see. We believe the Fordham campus in the Bronx had a certain outer borough texture, shall we say, that the Manhattan campus didn't have. But it's a pleasure to be back. To Dean Diller, who's doing an extraordinary job in a very short time. His mark is already made, and he's a heck of a nice guy. He said any student who was here today gets an extra half point on their GPA. So let's give him a round of applause for doing that. It's also fitting that we are at Fordham Law School because a former dean, Dean Feerick, worked on the issue that we'll be discussing today, campaign finance, election law, how do you make the system better, more democratic, more transparent. He had a series of hearings, and he performed the service at the direction of my father and probably did some of the most meaningful work that has been done since. So for that reason also, Fordham is an appropriate forum. We have a number of people who are here today who I'd like to acknowledge and thank. We're going to be issuing a counsel's opinion. My counsel is Alfonso David, who's with us, and I'd like to give him a round of applause because he did a lot of good work. We have from the district attorneys, who are very important, obviously 62 district attorneys enforce the state laws, can make a tremendous difference in the field we're discussing today. Tom Zugabe, who was the head of the District Attorneys Association, and the district attorney from Staten Island, McMahon. Nice to see you, D.A. McMahon and Tom Zugabe. Let's give them a round of applause. The Brennan Center is a great think tank organization that does work in elections and campaign finance. They were very helpful to me here. Michael Waldman is the head. Larry Norden is the technical expert in this field, and he's here, and I'd like to thank them. And Dick Dady from the Citizens Union, which is a good government group that does great work. Dick, thank you very much for being here today. Let me say this. These are disconcerting times. I think is an appropriate expression to sum up the times that we're in. There's been a lot of coverage about the politics and the campaigns and You can turn on cable news 24 hours a day, and they'll be giving you an analysis about how extreme and how different this campaign has been and how different the candidates have been. And they've been focusing on the campaigns and the candidates and the eccentricities of the campaigns and the candidates and how they're different than they were expected to be. But I don't think the real story is about the campaigns and the candidates. I think they are a response to the time. The stimulus is a citizenry that is disconcerted, that is alienated, that is afraid, that believes they've been left behind by the economy, that believes their government, which was supposed to be part of the solution, has actually turned out to be part of the problem. We have a country today that is skeptical about their economic future. They're frightened by terrorism with good cause, and they're frustrated by the constant gridlock of government. As if all of this is enough, people now fear that their political power, their ability to change and influence their government is being diminished. Today, they fear electoral impotence, that their vote and their voice is eclipsed. The combination of the economic anxiety, government failure, and political disenfranchisement is a toxic brew for this country. Now, our democratic process has changed dramatically recently. Campaigns have become more and more dominated by money. Now, not only must a person have money to compete on the political stage, but if you can't afford the price of admission, you don't even get into the audience. Unless you make a significant contribution, your voice is no more than a whisper in the political process. While there are many factors at play on how we got here, there's one single event that has caused much of the harm: the Supreme Court's case of Citizens United, which did more political damage to political participation than any Supreme Court decision in history. Indeed, the Citizens United decision ranks with the court's worst, and I believe it will go down in history as one of the most regressive decisions. Now, law students are here learning to honor the law, and we do honor the law. But even as we honor the law, we must recall that the Supreme Court is not always supreme in its actions, and the Supreme Court has in fact made terrible mistakes. The Dred Scott decision, which ruled that even if a slave lived free in a non-slave state for 7 years, that the individual was still a slave. Korematsu, which upheld the internment of U.S. citizens of Japanese ancestry during World War II. The Lochner case, striking down health and safety protections in the workplace. This trilogy of cases is the quintessential example of the court at its worst, tilting the scales of justice in favor of the powerful over the powerless. In its noblest moments, at its best, the Supreme Court has been a champion of equality and democracy and has actually transformed this nation for the better, there's no doubt. The principle of one man, one vote in Reynolds versus Simmons, outlawing the racist poll tax in Harper, affirming constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act in South Carolina versus Katzenbach, and outlawing the state's ban on same-sex marriages in the Hodges case. Citizens United will be in the history books for devaluing an individual's right to participate in the political system, for secreting the political process into the shadows, and bestowing the wealthy with additional political power that they never had before. The case Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Committee started life as an unremarkable dispute. A conservative group called Citizens United produced a film called Hillary the Movie. They wanted to show the movie on pay TV. The FEC regulated the work as an advertisement instead of a film. The producers objected, and that was the basis of the court case. Now, the court could have issued a narrow decision. It could have said, okay, it's a movie. Or they could have said the work was protected by the freedom of the press provision. But the court wanted to use the moment. They wanted to speak, and they wanted to take action. And by a 5-4 margin, the court issued a sweeping decree that prohibits government from restricting people and corporations from making unlimited independent political expenditures on behalf of candidates. In doing so, the court effectively undid a century's worth of state and federal campaign finance regulations. In his opinion, Justice Kennedy, who led the decision, relied on the principle of freedom of speech. Really, since 1976, the Buckley versus Vallejo case, the court accepted that contributing money to a political campaign was part of a person's First Amendment right to free expression. In that decision, the court rejected efforts to limit how much campaigns could spend, but the court did accept that there could be limits on the amounts that individuals can donate. Moreover, Buckley versus Vallejo said that there could be a different limit for the individual and for a corporation. Citizens United took a much, much different track, and it reasoned that government has no right to inhibit free speech. And by suppressing speech of corporations, both nonprofit and for-profit, the court ruled that the government was in effect preventing their voices and viewpoints from being heard. The court went on to reason that as a corporation is by law treated as an individual, hence the corporation has a right to free speech. The court further found that economics are a function of the marketplace, and a person or a corporation has the right to use their resources as they see fit. So in short, Citizens United said, money talks and big money talks louder. That's Citizens United in a nutshell. The court's ruling changed the political system as we knew it, and it birthed theoretically independent expenditure committees with unlimited contribution and expenditure capacities. Perhaps the most bizarre and incongruous is in Citizens United, the court did not overturn Buckley versus Vallejo. So today, you can only give $2,700 to a presidential campaign, but you can give $27 million to an independent expenditure committee that supports the president. It's ludicrous. 2 years ago, in McCutcheon versus FEC, the Supreme Court doubled down on its reasoning in Citizens United and struck down one of the few remaining restrictions on the ability of the very wealthy to spend in federal elections. In a dissent in McCutcheon, Justice Breyer wrote, and I quote, "Allowing the wealthy few to dominate political spending breaks the constitutionally necessary chain of communication between people and their representatives." The court, Justice Kennedy, with all due respect, missed that times have changed when it comes to free speech. When our founding fathers were working to protect free speech, they were afraid of government domination and government censorship. That was the risk at their time. Today, the challenge is not government domination of free speech, especially in the political arena. It is private sector domination and the domination of a wealthy few over the majority. And that is exactly what Citizens United did. Citizens United actually decimates the right to free speech by allowing it to be eclipsed by paid speech. Now, we don't need to speculate on the impact of Citizens United because it is clear and it has been an enormous negative. Citizens United created an industry of shadow political corporations and operatives. Spending by outside groups, so-called independent groups, those who operate independently of political candidates, more than doubled after Citizens United. In 2010, before Citizens United, there were 80 super PACs in the United States. 2 years later, there were 800. Before Citizens United, independent expenditures accounted for $90 million in spending. After Citizens United, 2 years later, instead of $90 million, it was $800 million in spending. In the 3 election cycles since 2010, super PACs have spent more than $1 billion. 60%, more than $600 million, made by just 195 people. In this election cycle, close to half the money raised by super PACs through the end of February came from just 50 mega donors and their relatives. Think about that. And it affects more than just the presidency. In 2014, independent expenditures in U.S. elections were 2,000% higher than they had been before. In 2008, total independent expenditures amounted to $17 million. In 2014, independent expenditures totaled $387 million. All in all, the top 100 donors contributed more than the bottom 4.75 million donors. 100 donors gave more money than 4.75 million people. And you wonder why people feel disenfranchised. Now, the abuses and the exploitation of Citizens United are not the province of one political party. This is not a Democratic problem. It's not a Republican problem. Citizens United ignited the equivalent of a campaign nuclear arms race. Both sides needed to engage to be competitive. Neither side could be outgunned. So whatever one side did, the other side had to match. And you've seen those abuses both by corporations and by unions to maximize the loophole that Citizens United institutionalized. Now the danger is the meltdown of the trust and the integrity of our electoral system as we know it. In its decision, the Supreme Court relied heavily on the concept that these groups would be, quote unquote, independent. They kept coming back to the concept of independence. And Justice Kennedy said, we conclude that independent expenditures, including those made by corporations, do not give rise to corruption or the appearance of corruption because they are independent. That position was either naive or Machiavellian. It was either a sham or at best a fig leaf. Justice Kennedy should have known that there were no aggressive disclosure and transparency requirements. He should have known that the independent corporations could be not-for-profit corporations for which there were no regulations of transparency and disclosure. So what has happened? Citizens United has effectively neutered state and local campaign finance laws. New York City's public finance system can now be circumvented by establishing shell independent expenditure committees or so-called advocacy committees that have unlimited contribution levels and can dominate the election cycle easily. New York State's campaign finance laws, decades and decades in the making, very prescriptive, very specific. You can either follow the state campaign finance laws, or if you can afford it, you set up an independent expenditure committee and you spend whatever you want, however you want to. Citizens United has bypassed the entire body of law when it comes to state campaign finance. With Citizens United, the dam burst and big dark money flooded the political system. Reform must start by addressing this perversion. So what do? Well, Citizens United must be reversed. Hopefully a new president and a new court will reverse Citizens United. In the meantime, we can't wait for that to happen. And we cannot allow this critical presidential election season to be manipulated and scandalized. Thankfully, the court did create an opportunity for states to greatly limit the corrosive impact of their decision. States can make a difference. States retain the right to promulgate regulations and pass laws that would limit the quote-unquote quid pro quo danger posed by large corporations giving large donations. The challenge to the states is to now seize that opportunity. One of the fundamental flaws in Citizens United is the fiction of the independent entities and the belief that they would actually, truly act independently. That was a false assumption. The collusion, the coordination, the subterfuge, the fraud in the current political system is rampant. And to this point, Congress, the FEC, and even the states have done a poor job in policing. And I include our state in that as well. New York has not enforced the law and the regulations the way it could. Instead, the coordination has been finger-pointing at best between federal and state authorities. It's not that people are unaware that the line of independence is blurred and stepped over every day. In fact, it is open and notorious. You will hear politicians speak openly about setting up their own independent committee. You can't set up your own independent committee. It is a clear legal violation. But they will say it, and the press and the public don't even blush. It is that open and notorious. We can determine evidentiary criteria to test the court's standard of independence. And today we're issuing a Governor's Council's opinion that will lay out those criteria and give the regulators and law enforcement officials guidance in how to bring these cases and do these enforcement actions. Among the factors to be considered is a candidate's personal interaction with the entity. Remember, the entity is supposed to be independent, no coordination, no cooperation, the state law says. Whether or not a candidate is attending functions, whether or not a candidate is doing fundraising, the personnel employed by the entity, and their relationship. Is the entity hiring former staff of the candidate? Sometimes the entity is run by family members of the candidate, and they claim that it's independent. What vendors and contractors the independent entity is using. Because if you knowingly hire the same pollster, the same media person, you can very easily be coordinating the two entities. Sometimes there's sharing of office space and sharing of non-public information. If the entity is disseminating material that is identical to the material that the candidate is disseminating. Overlapping donor bases. I don't believe in coincidences. As a general rule, I am more circumspect when you see hundreds of donors to the candidates committee, also being hundreds of donors to the independent expenditure committee. So this council's opinion will lay out those criteria. I urge New York State's regulators and law enforcement to take an aggressive stance. Use the New York State law to begin with. It prohibits cooperation of these entities, and we know they're doing it every day. The FEC has been complacent. and it's appropriate that the states step up and fill the void. Justice Brandeis loved to talk about states as the laboratories of democracy. This is a perfect opportunity for states to be the laboratory of democracy and not just experiment, but actually execute. I believe the state of New York can go even further. Besides issuing a council's opinion, I've been discussing the issue with the legislative leaders at some length and will propose stronger legislation incorporating the standards laid out in the council's opinion. This agenda is in addition to the comprehensive ethics agenda that I've already proposed. After the conviction of Assemblyman Sheldon Silver and Senator Dean Skelos, the public demands dramatic reform. I proposed limiting outside income for legislators in turn for raising legislators' salaries to a full-time level. I proposed 8 ways to close the LLC loophole. I proposed public financing. I proposed pension forfeiture for convicted officials. I believe we must stop political consultants who work for sitting elected officials from achieving special access and make them file as lobbyists so we know who they represent. The state legislature is in session, and they're in session until next week. They have plenty of time, and they can lead this effort to reform, or they can perpetuate the status quo. And my friends, the status quo is simply unacceptable. When you take a step back and look where we are, we have an upcoming election. 6 months we'll pick a new president, not just a new president, new Congress, new state elected officials, new senators. And that point is going to be a point of demarcation for this country. And it will point the way forward. There is no doubt that we have significant issues in this country. We have economic issues, we have international issues, we have the threat of terrorism, we have public health issues with new diseases. We have significant challenges. But there's also no doubt that this country, when it is at its best, and it is focused, and it is united, it can do anything it wants to do. And we have proven that time and time again. When we are together, we are unstoppable. But today, we are not together. There is a division. There is a tension in this country that I have never sensed before. You see it reflected in a federal government that is gridlocked, that has stayed there year after year pointing fingers. He's wrong, he's wrong, he's wrong, accomplishing absolutely nothing. You know what happens in gridlock? Everybody loses because the country does nothing. And when the country does nothing, you don't move further ahead. But we've gotten to a political paralysis with both ends of the political spectrum superheated, citizens alienated, and we have paralyzed our government. The question is now, what happens in November? And are we going to send a signal, and is that going to be a moment that is going to continue the paralysis, or are we going to track a different course? And are we going to have an election cycle that says, you know what? We have to find a different way. We have to find a way together because gridlock and paralysis doesn't work. If that is the track we're going to pick, we have to have an election that restores trust and confidence in people. There has to be an election where people say, you know what? My vote counted. This was a clean process. This was a fair process. And whoever wins, I accept, because I accept the process. We know what happens in the alternative. We saw Gore v. Bush. Remember Gore v. Bush? Hanging chads in Florida, week after week after week. Supreme Court made the decision. It shook this country to its foundation. Why? Because The Supreme Court's not supposed to make the decision. I'm supposed to make the decision, and you're supposed to make the decision, and you're supposed to make the decision, and we were supposed to be able to count votes, and the votes made the decision. Not where the Supreme Court says, I will tell you who the president will be. This election season, I am afraid we get to election night, and unless we clean up this process, the voters are going to feel that they were scammed, that they don't know who to believe. You turn on the TV now, you see TV commercials by all these committees saying everything about everybody. You don't know who they are. Every committee, a better citizen for a better state, a better country for a better world, a better tomorrow for your better child. Everything is better. Nobody knows who anybody is. It wasn't supposed to be this way. And if we're going to make a difference, you have to start today in the election and clean up the election. And there is no better place to start than the state of New York. Why? This legislature can do it. This legislature can do it. They can take a negative circumstance and they can make it a positive. You just had 2 legislative leaders convicted, the head of both the Senate and the head of both the Assembly. The legislature wants to say, we can be trusted. We understand. That was an anomaly. There's no better way to do it than to pass real reform that makes a real difference with ethics and takes on the #1 challenge in this nation, which is Citizens United, which is not just a New York challenge. It is a nationwide challenge. And until you fix that, you fix nothing. The New York State Legislature can do that. Why New York? Because New York is New York. I worked in the federal government for a time. I worked in all 50 states. And I spoke in all 50 states. I was a member of President Clinton's cabinet on all different topics. Inevitably, in whatever state I was in, somehow they would figure that I'm from New York. I don't know how they would do it. But they would come up and they would always say, what is New York doing about this? Why? Because we're New York. And they look to New York. New York has a history and a legacy of leading, of figuring things out first. Why? We're a little older, we're more complex, we're more diverse. A lot of the problems manifested themselves here first, so we had to solve them first. And we are a progressive state. And you look back through history and you look at the progressive movements, most of them started right here in New York. Workers' rights movement started right here in New York, Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Women's rights movement right here in New York, Seneca Falls. Environmental rights movement right here, Storm King. Civil rights movement, NAACP, started here. Gay rights movement started here, Stonewall. Let the clean election and democracy restoration movement start here. And you don't have to look back into the history books. This state has been leading the nation now, in your lifetime, while you've been in school. This state stepped up, first big state to pass marriage equality, gay marriage. And it changed the course of that issue all across the country. Why? Because when New York passes it, it's a fair question for every elected official in the United States of America. And the next day they take that microphone and they put it in their governor's face or their senator's face and they say, well, New York passed gay marriage, where are you? That's the power of New York. We did it with marriage equality. This legislature did it when they stood up after Sandy Hook and passed gun control called the SAFE Act, which is the best gun control law in this nation. The legislature did that. We did it this year when we came back and we passed $15, the best minimum wage law in the United States of America that acknowledges economic equality, and there are people who are suffering, and they've been suffering too long, and minimum wage is the best way to start to make a positive statement on income inequality. We did it when we passed paid family leave. which is the best law in the United States, which honors women and honors family and restores decency to the workplace. This legislature did all of that. And they can stand up and make this statement today. It is crucial that this election cycle be one that restores the trust of the people. And it's very simple at the end of the day. Democracy is not for sale. That's the premise of this country.
Governor Cuomo,
Democracy is not for sale. Okay. Democracy is not for sale. And rich man, poor man, rich woman, poor woman, one vote of equal value. That's what these reforms will do. New York should lead the way. Thank you, and God bless you.